Hello and welcome to Tech Talk Thursday. I can't believe it's Thursday already. The week has been flying by and we've got tons of stuff still coming up this week, which we'll talk to you about and next week as well. So today I thought I'd take you through a presentation that I did some time back, which is all about learning how to get decent exposure on your camera by exploring something phenomenal called the exposure triangle. And it's all about the interrelationships between three key settings on your camera, which we'll go into in a minute. But first of all, let's bring Mr. McKenna onto the show. Hello, Martin. How are you doing?
Hello, Radioland. Yeah, I'm doing good. Spring has sprung in Edinburgh. We've got some sunshine, and it's still cold, but plenty of crocuses popping up and a couple of little daffodils, and yeah, all looking a bit brighter than it was for the last month or two. So, and of course, it's a little bit lighter during the day rather than pitch black at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, yeah, a little bit less depressing than the last month or two.
Very nice. Well, March is nearly upon us as well, and we must think about how we change our timings in a couple of weeks as well, because daylight savings time will kick in for the US folks at the end of I think it's next week, something like that. So we'll have to maybe tweak our times or just keep them or let people know. I don't know. It all gets confusing, and it's for 3 weeks, right? In the same period every year. That 3 weeks where we're all different for a period of time, and then so on. So yeah, we've got the rain. So congratulations, you've got nice sunshine. We've got the rain, but we have lots of shows coming up. As we like to do multiple shows now a week. We're not interested in just doing 2 a week. We decided to, do another one this week. So maybe let's do the CTA and then we can talk about what we're actually doing. So tomorrow we have got Mr. Alec Johnson and Fulgens Henry on a special vertical show tomorrow at 1 p.m. UK, 8 a.m. Eastern for Fulgens. And more importantly, Martin, what time is it for Mr. Johnson over in Thailand?
So it will be, Fulgens will be having his breakfast at 8 in the morning. We'll be having our lunch at 1 o'clock, and Alec will be having his dinner at 8 p.m. in Thailand. So, we're really spanning the world this time and covering all time zones. But actually, I think, that could work quite well. People watching stuff over breakfast or lunch, or then, Alec throwing the children out and watching us at 8 o'clock in the evening. And but I've been wanting to get Alec on for a while because I talk to him most weeks as part of his academy, but because he operates in Thai time, it makes it difficult. He also frequently gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do stuff because it's pretty hot in Thailand, and so he's doing stuff very, very early in the morning, and then he goes to bed quite early as well, because it's too hot quite often in the evening. So you go to your air-conditioned bedroom, presumably. So it made it very difficult to find a good time, but that seems to work for him. All we need to do now is find some time that we can schedule with John in Australia, because that doesn't work at all. That's really, really difficult to get a time which is mutually convenient for him. And I think both you and I have been on DJ Strick's stream show at midnight on a Sunday for us. So,
yeah, you can't get everybody all the time. And John Lacey from Australia has actually joined, I think, one of the shows previously. I can't remember now. But anyway, which was interesting. So we have to try and find a mutually good time for everybody, and it is difficult with spanning these time zones. But this is an experiment for us as well. So we're thinking that if more people are going to join at that time on a Friday, 1 p.m. for us, it might be easier to actually push those shows to that time and make it easy for people at both sides of the pond. But we'll see. We're experimenting all the time, aren't we? That's the main thing. So that's the show on Friday. And maybe you want to suggest and tell people what's coming up on Friday of next week, because we're going to skip a Thursday, I think, right?
Yeah. So the show tomorrow is vertical with Alec and Fulgens, and I'm hoping that's going to be real interesting. We're going to do some different things on that show. So new week, new look and feel. I didn't think I'd be saying that for vertical, that you could get lots of different looks and feels. because most people are just sort of looking into their iPhone and doing the selfie stick thing, or if you're really lucky and advanced, then it'll be one person above another person. That's it. We're doing far, far more in that vertical screen estate than I think I've seen anybody doing. And tomorrow, again, it's going to be totally different from any of the other. I think we've done maybe 6 so far,
Right.
and they've all been very different. But I think people are starting to look at it, and it's all an experiment at the moment. It's the Wild West in terms of LinkedIn. But people are starting to look and notice, because I think there's something like 100 views overnight on the thing that we did on Tuesday, where we had no guests. It was just me and Neil talking for 45 minutes and experimenting with some layouts, and then 100 people have watched it overnight. So clearly there is an appetite to explore and to experiment, so we're taking that a bit further. So yeah, tune into this space tomorrow, where if it doesn't work at all, it's Neil's fault, and if it works but looks terrible, it's my fault, which I always think is a bit unfair, because nobody really knows if it doesn't work at all, because then it just doesn't appear.
Then we just disappear and never do it again. So that's the way it works.
We do.
Right?
That's the way it works. And then next week, I'd asked Johnny Byrne to pop on as a guest to this show. He can only make the Friday, so we've decided to schedule it on the Friday instead, from 4 till 5 p.m. on the Friday. And Johnny is a bit of a green screen master wizard, and he's also a big OBS fan, and he was a little bit concerned that we may not want OBS people on the show. And I said, we have OBS friends plenty, and they're all welcome on the show. So we're going to be talking a little bit about green screen. So this is where I actually tell everybody I'm on green screen right now. So this is me on my office, not with millions and millions of lights, which most people seem to think you need for green screen, but just exactly the same lighting, more or less, with the addition of one hair light, which is something that points down to my head, and a light lighting up my green screen behind me. But if you ask anybody else, they're going to think I'm in my normal office environment. This is where you normally see me. So I could scoot off to Thailand for the week and take a bit of green screen material with me and have this as my backdrop, and nobody would have known that I'd left the office. So plenty of good reasons to use green screen.
I didn't know when Martin joined that he was on a green screen. Had no idea. So yeah, that should be fun. And sorry, got Daryl joining us. Thanks for joining us, Daryl. And you don't need to learn anything, Daryl, because you know everything about cameras, because that's what you do. And I'm just going to try and get these comments in the right place, which they should be, but I don't understand why they keep moving. I'm just going to keep them there. Let me just try that again. Very clean, he says. So that is very cool. Let me just change this again.
Thank you, Daryl.
Why does that keep changing? That's just annoying. Okay, that'll do for now. All right. So yes, so Martin's green screen is super clean, and we're looking forward to having Johnny on the show next Friday. It does get a bit confusing with these changing times, but we always post up front. We do schedule, and we also let people know every Monday via LinkedIn on what we're doing for the week. And Saeed is here. Hello, fellow OBS person. Saeed is here. Hello from Germany. How is it going, Saeed? Hope you're doing very well. So let's talk about camera stuff, shall we, for a little bit. I've got a presentation that I did a few months ago now with Brian, who's a photographer and an Adobe ambassador. So we'll just go through a few of those, show you a few of the settings on the Sony camera that I've got set up here. We've even got some props to play with, and that's about it. Please ask questions along the way. Applies to you as well, Martin. Don't ask me too many difficult questions, because I probably won't be able to answer them, but I'm sure you're going to do it anyway. So let's go on to Keynote and just explain, first of all, about what the exposure triangle is. And the reason why it's called the exposure triangle is because there are 3 settings on your camera that have a relationship with each other, i.e. if you change one, it's going to change the exposure of your image. So a combination of these settings, whether it be ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, which we'll explain and talk about in a second, they're all going to have an impact on how your image looks coming out of your camera. Now, the good news is if you're not a photographer and you're doing video like myself and Martin and all the Ecamm OBS family, if you're doing video recordings, live streams, whatever you're doing with your camera from a video perspective, then this is the one that doesn't change for you, because we're always going to fix our shutter speed, and we'll talk about why that's important and how that's calculated a little bit later. So when you're fixing the shutter speed, the only things you have to play with regards to getting your exposure set right is your aperture and your ISO. So what is exposure? Well, I'm going to show you 3 different images, one over, one under, and one normal exposure. So the first one is an underexposed image. And what do we mean by underexposed? Well, it's dark to start with, so all the shadows are crushed. You can't really see a lot that's going on. There's not much detail in there, and the image isn't very bright at all. The converse of that, or the reverse of that, sorry, is an overexposed image. Overexposed is where everything is deemed to be blown out. So this is a blown out image where the whites are super white, you've lost all the detail, there's nothing in the image, and you can't really see what's going on. A correctly exposed image is the one in the middle. So this is typically what is deemed to be a correctly exposed images. You've got nice dynamic range between light and dark. Things look to be reasonably in detail and in focus, has the right color, nothing's too bright, nothing's too dark, and so on. And it is quite subjective. You know, some people will set their camera intentionally dark to have a bit more of a moody feel compared to somebody who wants a bright studio and so on. But to get exposure right in your camera is quite important to make sure that you don't get noise on your image and your colors don't look washed out and things like that. So we'll go through a few things around how that works. Saeed was explaining, please explain what lens. My comments are all over the place. Come on, I'm going to go back to the main image 1 second, and then I can get Saeed's comment up properly, because it doesn't work on that scene. So Saeed is asking, please explain which lens would be great to use for shots like mine for a DSLR. Okay, we can talk. Oh, and he's also asking about, you saw a recommendation for the Sigma 18 to 50, not 2.8. Not sure the values make sense. Yes. So the lenses that I use, and it is a good question, I'll talk about the lens that Martin uses as well. So my lens is fixed, which means it's called a prime lens. It's a fixed focal length, i.e. it doesn't zoom in or out, and you can buy these various lenses at different focal lengths. And we can talk a little bit about that later. But mine in particular is a 35mm Sony lens, and it's got a very low aperture, which we'll talk about in a second, which is my aperture is set at 1.4 to give you this blurry background. And Martin uses a Sigma, I think 60mm lens, and he's got one there. How many of these lenses, is this your box, or do you have more than one lens? Of course, you've got 2 lenses, haven't you?
That's the empty. That's the empty box. Well, I have 2 lenses, but this is the one that you're currently looking at, and this was as recommended by Adrian Sotensbury, and I know very little about cameras, so I just do what I'm told. but before that, I had a wider angle lens before that on the camera, and I did notice, because I've got some straight lines in the background behind me, so you can see the line between the brown and the blue area. I noticed them slightly curving, and I'm sure that was the lens that was doing that. But
yes.
So yeah, maybe you can explain the difference between that lens and the other one I've got, which I've totally forgotten the specification of. So all I know it's a wider.
Yes, so Martin's got a 60mm lens, which gives you a much more wider field of view, which means you're going to get more in your image. But with that, there comes or can come distortion. So depending on how wide your lens is, whether it's 60mm, 12mm, I mean, they go down to 11mm, they get really, really super wide. You start to see something called a barrel distortion, where the straight lines become a little bit curved. Now, there is a way to do that. If you've ever played with a GoPro, they have a fisheye lens, which tries to encapsulate as much of the image as possible. But with that comes this sort of weird sort of dome round effect. And there are plugins that you can correct that, where it pushes the image out and straightens it and so on, so it doesn't make it more fisheye. But for just everyday general use, The more versatile lenses tend to be these zoom lenses, which is what Said was talking about. So something like an 18 to 50 will give you quite a wide angle lens to start at 18 millimeter, and the 50 millimeter is deemed to be the natural focal length for portraiture photography, for something like that. So a 50 millimeter lens is going to give you the best looking image from a portrait perspective, like a talking head. Anything between 35 and 50 millimeter is pretty decent. I'm using a 35. I've also used a 50. They call them the nifty 50s because they're the ones that are used a lot for photography. And for Martin's image, the 60 millimeter is going to give him a wide angle view where he can get more of his studio in, particularly when he's doing green screen. And you can always crop and do things in OBS or Ecamm if you're doing live streaming and recording later anyway. So the rule of thumb is really just pick a lens that you are going to use for a specific environment. Not one lens is going to be great for every environment. If you're doing portraits and things like that, maybe get a fixed focal length lens like a 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter. And if you're doing more landscape photography or you want something with more versatility, even in the studio, one that has a zoom, an 18 to 50 millimeter, for example, means that you can play around. You don't have to move your camera, because obviously to get closer to your image, you're going to have to move your camera to get closer or use a digital zoom, which I don't recommend. If you can use the actual zoom in your camera and not use a digital zoom, you're going to get much better quality. So Saeed is saying...
So,
go ahead.
Secondary question then.
Okay.
So let's say we've got a good friend, Lindley Gooden.
Yes.
Who does some video where he has got the whole of his body in shot, and he's standing up and effectively on a white backdrop and has all sorts of clever stuff going on.
Right.
What sort of lens would I need to be able to get me full height but in a relatively small space, or is that just not possible because of the distance between the camera and the person?
Well, you could probably get away with it now with your 60 millimeter lens, because you don't necessarily have to have the camera in landscape mode. You could actually turn the camera around to have it more of a vertical format. So you get more height top to bottom, and you could use it that way. I mean, if you go down the realms of like a 12 millimeter lens, then you may get some distortion. But if you can move your camera further back, you're going to get more of the image in. So it's just a matter of playing with that. But I think with the 60 millimeter that you've got right now, that's pretty wide. On the camera that you've got. I'm not going to get into the difference between 60 millimeter on a full frame versus 60 millimeter on a crop sensor, because that does change the focal length. So a 60 millimeter, when we talk about 60 millimeter, 35, 50, they're always referencing those lenses being on a full frame sensor, which is basically the distance, the 60 millimeter and 35 in real terms. But when you start to take a 60 millimeter lens and put it on a cropped lens camera, similar to yours, that 60 millimeter will now become something like a 24 or a 32, depending on the type of crop that you have. So you have to do some calculation with that lens. So sometimes it's a 1.5, sometimes it's a 1.6 times crop, depending on what camera that you have. So it's always worth matching that up and looking at that. And I think, I can't remember what you've got. Have you got a ZV-E10?
Yeah.
I can't remember if that's a full frame or a crop sensor. I think it's a crop sensor. So typically...
It is cropped, yeah.
Yeah, so you would be looking more now at a sort of 20 to 30 millimeter. You've probably got a similar focal length to me. Even though your lens is 60 millimeter, your camera is making it either a 24 or a 30 millimeter crop, something like that. So in answer to your question, you probably need a wider lens on your camera to get more of your frame in, or move your camera back.
Or turn it to portrait and see what happens. Try that. But interesting. I don't think there's any pre-made mounting capability for turning it to portrait. Actually,
I think if you actually turn the camera, physically turn the camera, it will do it for you. And I can show it on the ZV-1 later, because I've got that set up and I can turn it around. So I think most cameras now, the Sony ones at least, will actually flip into portrait mode, into vertical mode, as and when they're actually tilted.
So what I mean is, there isn't a mounting point like that
on
the side of the camera.
So you could get something like a ball head which has a 90-degree tilt in it. So you get a ball head here, which is fixed at the bottom, and then you can unscrew it, and it just tilts that way, and then your camera then becomes... Yeah, so you might have to invest in a ball head for your tripod.
Which I think I already have, actually.
Oh, there you go. You've got one knocking around somewhere that you're not using. Okay.
So.
Oh dear, that's cool. Well, yeah, that would work as well. So it's worth experimenting with, and I know people are doing that now, where they've got a little camera set up just in that sort of vertical mode for doing shorts and vertical cameras. So that might be a good use case for your secondary ZV-10. Because have you got the same lens, by the way?
No, the second lens is another Sigma lens, but it's a much bigger zoom lens. It's taking it off, trying to... it doesn't tell me on the front of that one what it is. I can't remember. No. No, we'll come back to that.
We'll take a look. So some questions and comments coming in. So Daryl says he loves the 16mm Sigma, but it's too wide angle for his current camera, so he uses a kit lens 24 or 25. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the shot that you're going for and so on. Saeed mentions that a 35mm for sitting shots, no outdoor shootings, would be a sweet spot. Yeah, 35 would be good, or a 50mm as well. It just depends on your budget. Some lenses can cost up to $1,500, $2,000 just for the lens alone. It's just a lot of money, yeah, €500, so nothing to buy without putting thought into it. Yes, so it's worth experimenting and looking at what you can get for your money. The Sigma lenses are very, very good value. They're very good quality lenses, good quality glass. They fit well on the Sony or the other DSLR cameras, and they all adhere to the Sony autofocusing as well. And Daryl just says, good point about the crop sensor. So you got an A6400, which is a crop sensor. So a 16mm, I think it's 16 times 1.5 would give you the actual focal length. You'd have to look up online what the crop ratio is, but it's typically around 1.4, something like that. So you just take 16mm times 1.4, and that's going to give you the full frame equivalent of actually what your lens is on your camera. All right. Did you find out what your lens was?
I'm just... Yeah,
still looking.
Didn't, but what I thought I might do is just switch to the other camera and then just see what that looks like. Because I have no idea what's going to happen now, but we'll find out in a minute.
Oh, I'll put you full screen for a second.
See my green screen's partially disappeared. Anyway, I'm shouting across the room.
Yeah, but you're quite... There's a lot of room in there.
But that's me on the other camera lens, and I'm actually going to be using this tomorrow on the vertical show, and I'll be appearing in vertical, hence why it's lined up roughly where I am at the moment.
It's quite wide though.
And this will then be cropped out, but then I have to change my lighting a little bit as well.
Yeah, there's
back to just me on the corner.
No problem.
Not very good. Let's go back to the other camera.
Yeah, Saeed says, in today's episodes of lenses and stuff, well, it's all related to cameras and exposures and stuff like that. So anyway, let's go back to... so that's overexposed, underexposed, and so on. Hopefully that makes sense. You can clearly see the difference in that. So the exposure meter on most Sony cameras is a numeric value, and it's the one that says MM at the side of it, which stands for multimeter. And that is going to give you an indicative, and I say indicative because it should not be taken as read. It's an indicative view of what your camera thinks your exposure is. Now, ideally, that number should be sitting at around 0, and I'll show you actually live on our camera in a second. So this is where you can eyeball your exposure in your camera. Now, I haven't got time today to go through the different types of metering modes, but what I mean by that is when you're pointing your camera at your subject, let's say it's you that you want to have perfectly exposed, the camera is going to read the available light associated with the image that it's pointing at. But the camera has got multiple different ways of gauging where that light is coming from. So just to draw on here, there's something called spot metering, for example, whereby the camera is going to take the reading of the available light only in this square box that's sitting in the middle, potentially, of your image. You can move that little square around and take different samples, But effectively, that metering number is going to be governed by where the camera is actually taking that meter reading from. Remember the old weddings and things where people would go up to you with a light meter and click and look at the available light? That's what the camera's doing. It's the same thing, but it's all doing it in camera. So depending on what mode you've got in your camera, you could actually take a reading of the entire image. Now for me, that's probably not a good idea, because over on this side is brighter than here, for example, or down here. So I want to have my metering in my camera actually just pointing at my face and giving me an exposure reading there, so I am not overexposed, and I don't really care about what's going on in the background because that's the look I'm going for. So again, there's different ways that the camera is going to understand and give you what this exposure meter reading is. So it's not an exact science with the camera. It can be incorrect. So it's worth using your eyes to see as well what that camera is looking at. There are other tools in your camera, things like histograms, zebras, which give you an actual more indicating or a better reading of the light coming in. And I can show you what a histogram looks like later, but it's just a graph. Exactly, something like that. Saeed also said that he's learned about grey cards recently. Do I use something like that to optimize my setting? It's right here. I'm going to talk about it in a moment. So, and thank you. It's almost like he knows what's coming up in this presentation. So thank you, Saeed. But we will be talking a little bit about grey cards, and that's really just to help with getting good skin tones and exposure for your camera. Let's crack on. We've only got 200 other slides to go through, so I better be quick. All right. Let's talk about aperture. This is one of the settings in the exposure triangle. Remember we talked about aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So aperture is something that will help you develop or show a depth of field in your image. Now, the aperture is basically the iris of your lens, of your camera, that controls how much light is coming in. There's lots of things that govern what controls the light coming in, but imagine this is the eye for your camera, and this is the f-stop, is what the amount of light is measured in. And the f-stop refers to how large or small the hole or the aperture in the front of your lens is that governs how much light is hitting the back of the sensor. And that's why it's always measured in the number or the letter F with a number after it. So in this particular example, an f1.4 means, and it's a bit, you've got to get your head around this, it's the opposite way to thinking. So smaller the number, the larger the aperture. So just remember that, the smaller the number, the larger the aperture, the more light coming into your lens. So if you wind your camera down to an f1.4, that is going to allow the maximum amount of light coming into your sensor. Martin's setup and my setup are very similar. We've tweaked our cameras or our settings down. So in my case, my aperture right now is at an f1.4. So that means I, the subject, are in focus and clear, and the rest of the image behind me is quite out of focus. So I'm getting a deep depth of field in this. So meaning, as you can see in this particular first image, the subject here is in focus and the background is out of focus. So that's what gives you that nice depth of field, that lush background that everybody's looking for. So that's achieved in this particular case by having an aperture setting of very low numbers. So in this case, f1.4. As you turn and change that aperture value up, you can see that it changes the way the focus points in your camera, what's in focus and what's out of focus. So as the more you move it up to a higher number, in this case f22, you're looking at most of the image being in focus. So if you're looking for a flat image, looking at getting everything in focus, because that's the look you may be wanting to go for. If you're in a cookery show, if you're doing yoga or Pilates or something like that, you might want all your people in different rows as they're situated in your room to be in focus. You may not want to be focused on the person at the front of the camera. So changing the aperture value, this F number, is going to control what's in focus versus what is out of focus. And it depending again on the look that you're going for. So that is a great way of just sort of giving you an idea of how that focus and depth of field works in relation to f-stops. Now the f number is down here. The aperture value is denoted by the f number, and you can change this on your camera, and I'll show you a practical example in a minute on how that is actually controlled. But if you've ever wondered what the f number is on your camera, then that's what it's for. Now, a lot of people, when they do buy their cameras, they just set them up in automatic mode. Let the camera control the exposure. And 90% of the time, the camera is going to do a decent job. It's going to control the exposure for you based on the settings that it thinks. But if you want to have control of your image, and you've set up your lighting correctly, and you've got your white balance set right, then I would highly recommend in your camera you set it all to manual, and then you have the control of what your image looks like, and you can change and get this nice blurry background. You can make things light, you can make things dark, depending on what you want. And I would suggest that you set your camera to manual mode in order to do that. So, any questions, Martin, whilst we're going on here?
No, but there's plenty of plenty of scope. Yeah, plenty of comments. Scope for jokes. Though you've been exposing yourself naturally all over Portugal for years.
I've years. I mean, this is what it looks like. Yes, with my F numbers, exactly. Let's see. So thank you, Daryl. Great illustration. Thank you very much. Yeah, it is easier to try and put this pictorially because it is hard to explain just by talking. So on. Thank you, Chris. We do try. Yes. And as Daryl said, F is F for focal length and not for anything else. Hey, John, thanks for joining as well. You've often wondered what these settings are referring to. Well, this is why we're trying to do this, to make sure, try and demystify some of this camera stuff. Cameras can be a little bit daunting, but once you get your head around what they all do and how they relate to each other, it's pretty straightforward. All right, let's crack on. It's already 5:30. So, real quick, here's an example of a shallow depth of field. This cat has a shallow depth of field. It has a large aperture number, so the cat is beautifully in focus and the background is blurry. They often refer to this as bokeh or bokeh, depending how you pronounce it. But the bokeh is basically the blurriness of the background. You can achieve that with different types of lenses as well. But this is deemed to be a shallow depth of field. This image here I took, this is in Coimbra in Portugal, and as you can see, there's quite a shallow depth of field as the trees in the background go further back. You can see that they're more out of focus. An example here of a deep depth of field, i.e. where lots of things are in focus. This is a shot from the iPhone, again in Portugal, and you can see most of the houses are in focus. Even some of the background is in focus as well. So I shot this with a very large focal length number, f-stop number of f11 or f15, whatever the iPhone actually goes up to. So that was shot like that to give you everything basically in focus. And here's another example. This is in Tomar in Portugal, where I was trying to get a shot of the parade that's going on, the procession, which is this big flower procession that happens. As you can see, there's clouds. We even have clouds in Portugal. And it was a grey day, but you can see most of this stuff was in focus. So this is like a deep depth of field, as it's called, where most of the stuff is in focus, shooting at a very high F number in order to get as much of the shot in focus as possible. All right, ISO or ISO. It's actually ISO. This is the sensitivity to the available light on your camera's sensor. Now, if you remember back in the day when you used to take film, you used to buy a film with an ISO rating or an ISO rating. It had to be 200, 400, and 800. Do you remember those days where you actually go out and get film?
I do.
Yeah. So the reason why they had those numbers on them is the ISO value was related to, well, what are you actually shooting? So you had to actually have a bit of preparation and thought around, well, what am I going to be shooting in? So if you're going on a beach and shooting your holiday snaps, then you typically get an ISO value that's maybe 100, 200, or 300, a low number, meaning that I know I'm going to get a ton of light in my available environment. So I need an ISO value that's going to be less sensitive to the light that's available. So a lower ISO number means that I don't need, I have lots of light available, so my sensitivity is very, very low in that case. So that's why you would have a low ISO number. If I'm going indoors and shooting the wedding and it's pretty dark and I'm trying to shoot the cake and stuff like that, I may have to go and buy film which is 800 to 1000 ISO because I don't have as much light, so I need the film to be as sensitive as possible to the available light in the environment, so I might choose a higher ISO number. So your camera, your digital camera, is or can be very grainy, the image, if you turn this ISO value up too much. Now, the noise, as it's called, it's digital noise, is always there in the sensor. You can't get away with that. It's already built in. But what you can do is you're basically controlling the volume, if you like, and the sensitivity of that sensor based on this ISO value. So here's a couple of quick examples. The ISO number is down here. And most cameras now start around, well, I've got cameras that start at 60 ISO, all the way up to maybe 12,000 ISO if you're shooting outdoors, nighttime, you want to take some pictures of the stars and things like that. But you'll see that there are some effects of when you start to go higher with that ISO number, it can have a detrimental effect on the image. And again, it's a balancing act. So let's take a quick look at what those things do. On the left, we have an image that was taken with a very ISO number. Let's say it's, I don't know, 5,000, something like that. Okay. Now, when you go high on your ISO value and you're starting to crank that number up, you're going to introduce the noise that's already in the sensor. So you're going to make that noise more visible in your image. Now, there are applications that can clean up your image for you. And if you don't really have a choice, then maybe because of the lens that you're using and the shutter speed and so on like that, maybe you have to use a high ISO value in order to get the exposure that you need. But the higher the ISO value, the more noise you're going to introduce into your image. And you may have seen that where people, you've got your camera, you've set it in your room, you're trying to take an image of yourself, you're trying to get the video set up right, you've cranked up the ISO and you start to see all this digital noise. That's the reason why. You're basically just tweaking the sensor's sensitivity to the available light. And what you're doing is you're turning up that volume control, you're raising the gain, and as you do that, you're introducing noise. On the right-hand side, you have something with a low ISO value. So the image is nice and clean. There's no noise on that at all. So the rule is, the lower the ISO number in your camera, the less noise you're going to get in your image. And again, having manual control set on your camera and adjusting the various values and these interrelationships between ISO, shutter speed, and your f-stop, then you're going to be able to control that image to the best of your ability if you're in manual mode. If you let your camera do all the work, then your camera may bump up the ISO because it needs to have that turned up in order to get the image exposed correctly. So those are the reasons why the ISO values do matter. There's some questions. Hang on one sec. Let's have a look. Saeed said, "What's up with that cat's neck?" It's an AI-generated cat for purposes, so it wasn't anything that I took. I don't have any deformed cats at home, so I just didn't have a decent image of my cats to show you and illustrate the depth of field. But that's what happened with that. Chris says he likes his focal length. No words for that, Chris. Let's just crack on. And then Saeed says he just looked up out of curiosity. Your Elgato Facecam Pro is f2.0 and a 21mm. Yeah, so that's the equivalent. And your image looks pretty good, Saeed, as well. But it just depends on what type of look you're going for. Right, let's continue with slide number 84. Shutter speed next. So shutter speed, and this is the one where I mentioned before that if you're a video person, this is the one that you would just set and forget. But if you're a photographer, then the changing and the settings of the shutter speed will have an influence over how your actual photograph looks. So we'll just quickly show you. Shutter speed controls how fast the shutter opens and lets in the light into your camera. So if you want to freeze a fast moving cat, cheetah, car, whatever you're shooting, you will need to change your shutter speed to something very, very fast, like 1/3000th here of a second, which is going to freeze the image and almost make it look like it's not moving at all. As you start to change those values down, 1/60th of a second here or 30 seconds, you're going to introduce something called motion blur. Now, motion blur is a good thing when it comes to doing video, but it can be a bad thing if you're trying to take an image. And if you've ever taken an image where maybe you're a little bit shaky, trying to take a photograph, and you can see the image is looking like this here, it's because, one, maybe your shutter speed was too low and the image was moving too quickly for your settings. So just remember that if you want to freeze an image and make it look really static, then the higher the shutter speed, the less motion blur that you're going to get. But when we're talking about video, the shutter speed is the important factor to set depending on where you are in the world and the type of look that you're going for. The shutter speed value is set here. It's always 1/over something. For video in my world and in Europe, I set my shutter speed to 1/50, and so does Martin, and I'll tell you why that is in a second, because it all relates to something called frame rates. Now in video, you've got frames per second, and frame rate refers to the individual frames or pictures that are coming into the camera. Now back in the day, movies were all basically filmed at 24 frames per second. And that was just the mechanism that they came up with when they were making films, and that stuck to this day. So if people talk about that film look, getting the cinematic look, then typically you would shoot all your video in 24 frames per second. Obviously, for TV and things like that, you have 30 frames per second and 60, and then to start slowing things down, you may want to look at 50 frames per second or 120. So I'll just show you a quick setting here. So this is where the frame rate is controlled in your camera. There's a setting on there, and you set either 24, 25, 30, 60, 120, depending on what you want in your camera. To give you an idea of mine and Martin's are set, we're both set our frame rates to 24 frames per second, and our shutter speed is 1/50. And the reason why that is because you want to have your frame rates to be half of your shutter speed. So if I've got a frame rate here of 24 frames per second, I want to have 24 times 2, in which case is 48. We don't have 1/48 on most cameras, so we'd have to set it to 1/50th of a second. So this is just the relationship, and it's actually based on something called the 180-degree shutter rule, which I won't go into too much detail, but it's all based on mechanical shutters back in the day and cinema cameras, whereby it's a half moon shape shutter that rotates round and lets in light every 1/48th of a second for 24 frames a second. So in our case, for videographers, and when we're setting up our cameras, if you're in the UK or Europe, and if you want that film look, then you would typically set your camera to 24 frames per second and your shutter speed at 1/50. And I've shown you here in the table use cases. If you're doing like live streaming or vlogs, YouTube actually pumps out this live stream at 30 frames per second, even though we've set our cameras to 24. It's just the way that YouTube works for live streaming. So if you are setting your camera to 30 frames per second, always set your shutter speed to 1/60. And for shows like the news, QVC and stuff like that, they typically shoot at 60 frames per second. If it looks like a soap opera from the 1980s where it's nice and shiny and has that video look, that's typically what they're shooting at. And that's something that I don't particularly like to go for. There is a video on my channel that explains and shows you the actual differences between 60, 30 and 24 frames per second. So if you want to have a look at that, you can. But this is just a table of how things are set. So the last thing I just want to talk about, and I'll just show you the camera, is if you've ever bought any lights and they're not actually dedicated video lights and you get this shimmering, flickering look, it can be really annoying and distracting for your viewers. So on some Sony cameras, there is something called the variable shutter. And what that means is that you can actually tweak your shutter speed in increments of 1 or 2. So instead of saying 1/50, 1/60, and so on, you can actually do 1/51, 1/52, 1/53. And all that means is you're dialing in the shutter speed to be in the same frequency of the lights. So lights and video lights should be set to the same frequency as your mains electricity. But typically, older, cheaper, crappier lights aren't, and they do tend to flicker. So when you set your camera to 1/50 and everything's set fine and so on, and you get this shimmering light, you may have to go in and start to tweak your camera settings to get rid of the flicker. You may never get rid of the flicker because it's basically the difference or the contrast between the light frequency and how fast your frame rate and shutter speed is on your camera. And if there's a mismatch, you're going to see the flicker on the screen. That's why Martin and I always encourage you to buy half decent video lights at least. They're not that expensive now that you can get, and if they say video lights on them, they're guaranteed to work in conjunction with the right frequency of where you are in the world and how your camera shutter speed and so on is set up. We have a couple of questions, which I'll have a look at that. So, do I upload my videos in 24 to YouTube? Yes, I do. So, when you upload a video to YouTube, YouTube honors whatever frame rate you've set your video or recorded your video at. It's only for live streaming. I don't know why. I looked into it. They originally in Europe did have that setting where they allowed you to do 24 and 25, but they just did a blanket setting a few years ago where now everything is set to 30 frames per second if you're doing a live stream. So this live stream is going out at 24, but if you look at the stats for nerds, as it's called on YouTube, you can right click on your YouTube video right now, go to stats for nerds, you'll see the frame rate, you'll see the bit rate, you'll see everything that this video is being broadcast at. And you can actually go and look at it after the fact as well. And you'll see that it always says 30 FPS or something like that. Some people actually film their YouTube videos in 60 frames per second. Some people go live at 60 frames per second. But with that, if you do change and have a higher frame rate, you're going to increase the bit rate that you need on the internet in order to send that image. So if I now sent my stream to 60 frames per second, the internet bandwidth that I would need to push that to YouTube would almost double. So you've got to be wary about what you're doing that. And again, everything is a trade-off. So stats for nerds. Yes, Saeed didn't know that. And it's funny because when you look at it, you go, ooh, what's he set to? And that's how I discovered it. So, you know, we can all geek out at some point. Daryl says, cheap LED lights are really bad and lower exposures. Yes, you definitely get a lot of banding in the videos. Yeah, which is this sort of stripy, banding, horrible, wavy stuff that you see in some people's videos. You go, you've got cheap video lights, haven't you? So anyway, don't cheap out is basically what we're saying. Let me just have a look at the last couple of slides. All right, last but one, color temperature. Saeed, we were talking about this before. So color temperature is really important to set depending on the environment that you're in. So color temperature is all about the white balance, and the camera's color temperature is measured in kelvins, which is the K number here. So you'll see on this diagram that candlelight and morning evening light is around 2000 kelvins, and when it gets dark and a little bit shady, it's around 9000. So we typically set our video up in the middle around 5600 kelvins, which is daylight. My lights are all set to 5600 here at the front. And I also set my camera, if I don't expose correctly or use a grey card, which I'll talk about in a second, I set my camera to 5600. You can set it to auto white balance, but again, if you do, the camera is basically going to set its exposure and color temperature based on what it can read, and it doesn't always get it right. So don't use auto white balance, set your white balance correctly. And you can do that by getting one of these grey cards. And most modern cameras now allow you to set a custom white balance. And all you do with this grey card is that you get your camera and you set it to a value which is a manual color temperature setting. And the camera will take a picture of whatever you put in front of it and set that as its white balance. So you put the camera in front of your face, you put the card in front of your face, get the camera to take a picture, have everything set up how you want with the light, because you want to make sure that the lighting that you have in your room is what you're going to use for your video. Put the card in front, let the camera take a picture of this grey card. And 18% grey is basically best for skin tones. And this is how the skin tone is measured in most sort of cameras and things like that. So the camera's trying to guess, if you set it to auto white balance, what 18% grey is. But if you actually tell it what 18% grey is using the card, then that will get your white balance to be accurately set. And these grey cards, I think, are like $25 on Amazon. You can get more expensive ones, but it's worth investing in, especially if you want to make sure that you've got the right colour temperature for your environment. You can mess around and change the different colour temperatures yourself, but you'll see that there's obviously differences in how it looks. And that's not going to change your exposure, it's just going to change how your skin tones look and the actual overall view. You can either be too cold or too warm, and you can change that accordingly, but I wouldn't set it to auto white balance. I'd get it set to manual using a grey card, for example. So that's the exposure triangle. I'm just going to show you the settings on the camera, and then we're pretty much nearly finished, believe it or not. So let's go to the camera. This is the ZV-1. It's a real camera. I'm waving my hand in front of it right now. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. I think Martin asked before in the pre-show, how did I get these numbers on the camera itself? So I'm using HDMI output from this camera going into a capture card. And in the menu, which I can't see in the camera because I have to look on the monitor here, you go to this menu here. I think it's menu 4, page 3 of 6. This is the old Sony menu system. They've changed it recently. So when people ask me, where is this setting? I say, well, it just depends what camera you have. But if you have the Sony ZV-10 and the ZV-1, then this is the old camera system at the moment. And you just basically go to the camera HDMI settings here. And what we're seeing is the HDMI info display. So I've turned it to on for the time being, just so we can see all the controls in here. And all I'm doing is moving the thumb wheel at the back of the camera. So real quick, I've set my ISO to 200, as you can see here. And my F number is 1.8. And my shutter speed is going to be fixed at 1/50. I'm not changing that for this particular demonstration. You can see that the Ecamm the Ecamm cup is slightly out of focus, and the stuff here in front is perfectly in focus. And according to my multimeter, I guess it's supposed to be pretty much 0. So it's saying that this image is okay in terms of exposure. So let me show you what happens if I change the ISO value. So I'm going to change the ISO value and nothing else, and I'm going to change it to, I don't know, 1200. So the first thing you'll see is the image now looks crap. It's white, it's blown out, it's overexposed, and the multimeter can't go any higher than +2. So that's saying you are 2 stops or more over the exposure that you're supposed to be. So when you start to change the ISO value, you'll see that the actual exposure is coming down. See, now it's +1. I'll change it again to what it was, 200. And now it's set to normal. So you can see just changing the ISO value can affect the overall exposure of your image. The same goes for if I now change the aperture value. Now, if I change the aperture value, it's going to darken the image, which is what you would expect because I'm letting in less light. The higher the number, the less light is being let in, and so on. So as you can see, as I'm changing this, my multimeter is flashing saying now I'm underexposed. The image is too dark. What can I do to make this image properly exposed? Well, because I'm fixed here with my shutter speed, 1/50, because I'm 24 frames a second, the only thing I can change is my ISO. So I'm going to bump this up a little bit. Let's have a look at that. It's still a little bit dark. I'm already at 800. Let's go to 1250. Yeah, it's not too bad. The point is, now I've had to change my ISO to 1250. And in doing that, I may be introducing some noise in the shadows here. So the higher the number of the ISO, the grainier this image in the darker areas is going to be. And one other thing you may have noticed is now the Ecamm PAM, it's actually Ecamm FAM, the Ecamm FAM cup is a little bit more in focus. So because I've changed this value from 1.4 to 5, it means that this Stream Deck and this mug are more in focus now. If I was to change this further, I'd get more and more of this image in focus. If I was to wind it back down to f1.8 and change my ISO value to something more meaningful like 200, you'll see now that the Ecamm FAM cup is out of focus and this is in focus. So I'm changing the depth of field by adjusting the aperture as we spoke about before. So that's just really the three things that you need to be concerned about. But as videographers and as people who are doing live streaming and recordings, this is fixed, and the only two things you can change is your aperture and your ISO. The only other thing I would say is if you're outdoors and you want to have a nice shallow depth of field and your ISO value is at its lowest number, but you're still getting a very, very bright overexposed image, then you can invest in something called, just go to full screen, something called an ND filter. An ND filter is effectively just a pair of sunglasses for your camera lens. And this is a variable ND filter, which means if I start to spin it round, you can see that it gets darker. It's like those react to light repeat sunglasses you used to get, right? You go outside and they go really dark, and you go indoors and so on. And all that's doing is basically controlling the light that's coming into your camera without changing the aperture. So if I go back to the camera and just go over here and put it in front, you'll see that the image is darker now. And as I start to wind that down, the image is really dark. So if you're outdoors and in a very bright environment, it's really good to use something like a variable ND filter. And I recommend you getting a variable one because some ND filters come in a fixed sort of strength. So you might be swapping and changing them depending on what you are shooting and which environment you're in. So there's lots of different things that you can play with to get your exposure controlled. But the main point of this today was to just give you a little bit of an insight on how to control exposure on your camera, how to get your white balance set correctly, and what 3 settings that you need to be aware of in your camera that control the overall look and feel, how light and dark your camera is. And it's nearly 6 o'clock, so I nearly did it in time. There you go.
Oh, well, I've got a last question then you can fill up with.
Yeah, go on.
So, yeah, bearing in mind everything you've just said, if I wanted to go out and photograph the Northern Lights,
Ooh.
what are the best settings to use? Because I've seen a whole thing where people were taking pictures without being able to see anything.
Right.
And then they would look at the picture and they would be able to see the Northern Lights in the picture.
So,
which I didn't understand unless they were putting a long exposure on the picture or something. I didn't really get it. So
yeah, so what they would typically be doing, if I just go back to this thing, is to get like a picture of the Northern Lights or stars or things that are really sort of difficult to see, they would really be setting their shutter speed to something very low. Maybe a minute, 2 minutes. You can have cameras that actually will open up the shutter and leave it open for minutes. And doing that is going to let the maximum amount of light in. And because there's very little light with the Northern Lights or the stars, then that's how they're getting that image. Now, you can't see anything on the camera because it's so dark. So what they do is they take a picture with a very, very long exposure time, and then they look at the image later on the preview screen. But there's things on cameras called bulb setting, which means you have a little control for your camera. You plug it in. You plug it into the camera, and it's a shutter control, and you click on it, and it can be electronic, and you just click once, and you set it for like 2 minutes, leave it, and then the camera's going to take in all that light and take a picture that way. So that's how they're getting that Northern Lights or stars taken. It just depends on what they have, and obviously they have lenses that maybe are at an f1.2, f1.4, letting in as much light as possible, and then they've probably bumped their ISO up to something quite high as well. And there's not an exact science. It's about getting out, looking at the environment, and just taking a few sample shots, because you're never going to get it right first time, unless you're an expert, of course, and know exactly what you're doing, which I'm not. So there you go. Let me just see. This is a common live streamer question. Oh, right. Yes, Northern Lights, exactly. That is definitely a common live streamer question. So let's just recap. Carry on, sorry, Martin.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, you can ask any questions you like on this show. They don't.
Yeah, they don't have to be related to
could
what
be
we're doing. Exactly.
We could be live streaming with the Northern Lights in the background, but I have a feeling the shutter speed wouldn't work too well under those circumstances.
I know. Isn't the Northern Lights one of the default Zoom backgrounds that you get that everybody puts on? It looks a bit weird because you're showing the Northern Lights. Anyway.
Probably.
So what we got going on tomorrow, just to recap, Martin, we've got a great show tomorrow. You want to take us through that? I'll play the CTA. Go ahead. I'll say it then. So tomorrow we've got... Oh, you're on mute. I'm so sorry. Hang on. There you go. Go again, Martin. Sorry.
No, well, you can do this one. I'll do the next one.
All right. So tomorrow, folks, just remember we have a show 1 p.m. UK, which is 2 p.m. Europe time, 8 a.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Thailand time, because we've got Fulgens Henry, can't even speak now. We've got Alec Johnson and Fulgens Henry tomorrow live on the Vertical Show, and we haven't really had Alec on the show before. We've been on his shows and had a chat and stuff, but we've known Alec for a while, so it's nice to get him on the show. And as Martin said, at the top of the hour, it's his dinner time, so hopefully he'll have had his dinner and be able to join us. What a better way to enjoy a Friday evening. Will it be? Yeah, it'll still be Friday evening for him, won't it? Just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I normally say, good morning, good evening, good lunchtime, whatever it is, wherever you are. That will never be more applicable than tomorrow, because that will cover everything. So yeah, that's tomorrow lunchtime, and then next Friday rather than next Thursday, because our guest could only make the Friday. Johnny Byrne's going to join us, and he's an OBS fan and a green screen fan. So we'll be having a bit of fun, potentially, with OBS and green screen, which is currently what I'm doing as we speak. Yeah, it's green screen in the background, and it'll be more green screen next week, and it might even get some going on tomorrow as well. We'll see.
So don't forget to join us tomorrow. I'll be pushing it out on the socials just to remind you, but 1 p.m. UK, 8 a.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. whatever time zone Alec is in. What time zone is that? Is that, I don't even know what it's
Bangkok,
called.
I think.
Bangkok time zone, right.
Bangkok.
Bangkok time or something like that. Yes, so that should be fun.
Yeah.
Okay, and Saeed, we've told him 100 times now, so he's going to watch that one. Thank you, Saeed. It should be fun because Martin's going to work some vertical magic again, so yes, just watch this space. And then the show on Friday next week will be in full screen format because we want to show off, or Martin wants to show off some of the green screen capability in our widescreen format. So thanks to everybody for joining, and with that, we'll see you tomorrow.
Cheerio.